Horror is one of those genres that has an identity problem. Its defining quality is supposed to be frightening the audience, but anyone who's seen an 80s slasher flick knows that plenty of works with horror aesthetics are more amusing than scary. Video games suffer from this problem as well. The two classic survival horror video game franchises are Resident Evil and Silent Hill. But take a look at, say, Silent Hill 4 and Resident Evil 4, and you'll see a world of difference between them in terms of design, atmosphere, and tone. Like slasher movies, so-called horror video games have been getting sillier and less scary for more than a decade at this point. Attempts to get back to basics are plagued by an over-reliance on cheap jump scares and imagery that's become stale through repetition. Familiarity and cliché have robbed the horror genre of its ability to really scare us. That's why this Halloween, I won't be counting down my top 10 horror games, or reviewing a classic of the genre, or anything like that. Today's topic is a little more subtle. It's the horror that you don't expect, the little creepy and unnerving moments you sometimes find in games that aren't explicitly horror-themed. This Halloween, I invite you to get Surreal. The term surreal was first used in 1917 by the French critic Guillaume Apollinaire. He used it to describe the music of avant-garde composer Erik Satie, but the term quickly became associated with the visual arts, especially paintings by artists like Max Ernst, Joan Miró, and Salvador Dalí. People often assume that surreal means unrealistic, but a more accurate description would be hyper-realistic. Merriam-Webster defines the word as marked by the intense irrational reality of a dream, and in fact the goal of many surrealists was to convey the feeling of dreams in real life through their art. They wanted to paint something that felt more real than reality itself, to find a connection between dreams and reality that would make sense of both. In the process, they ended up depicting a lot of ugly, complicated emotions in grotesque forms. This is part of the reason why, even though the goal of surrealism isn't to be scary, a lot of people do get freaked out by it. The point is that surrealism isn't just being random or weird for the sake of it. What creates that eerie, hair-raising feeling is the impression that what you see isn't just weird, but that it makes an odd kind of sense. A lot of video games have incorporated surreal or dreamlike elements into their stories, gameplay mechanics, and visual design. Some games, like Yume Nikki, appear to have been designed purposely to be surreal from beginning to end, but this doesn't work for most games because it makes traditional storytelling practically impossible. When most games get surreal, it's only for a brief scene or two, and the craziness quickly gets dialed back to a more comfortable level. Horror games tend to use a lot of surreal imagery, especially games like Silent Hill, which emphasize atmosphere over explicit scariness. But that's kind of the problem. Horror games often have so many surreal moments in them that they all seem to melt together and lose the shock value that makes them surreal in the first place. It makes me think about when Matthew Matosis reviewed the Stanley Parable, and he pointed out that the constant twists in its narrative lost all their freshness when it became clear that the whole game was nothing but twists. He said in that review that a game with a single well-placed twist was much more shocking and memorable than a game with 100 shallow twists in a row. I think the same thing is true for surrealism, which is why I'm going to be discussing games outside the horror genre. Instead of constantly throwing horror in your face, these games keep it in the background, and by the time you realize something about what's happening is kind of off, bam, it all clicks, and suddenly it was a horror game the whole time. Here then are 5 surreal moments in gaming that I found particularly memorable. Odd juxtapositions of objects, eldritch presences whose true forms cannot be grasped, and a feeling that danger is lurking just out of the corner of your eye. You'll find it all here, starting with Chapter 2 of Super Paper Mario sees Mario and the gang heading off to Gloam Valley to find the wizard Merlee. But when you get to her house, you don't find her. Instead, you see this girl, Mimi, who claims to be Merlee's maid. She sends you off to several rooms looking for Merlee, every one of which contains a death trap. Mimi laughs this off and says she must have made a mistake, but when you later break a vase and get sentenced to hard labor as a result, it becomes pretty obvious that Mimi's doing everything she can to keep you from figuring this out. Naturally, you escape and go to the one place you haven't searched yet, the basement. Mimi tries to lead you astray again, this time pretending to be Merlee herself, but thanks to a message from the real Merlee, you see through this. And that's when Mimi, in her own words, gets ugly. It turns out that Mimi not only isn't who she said she was, she's not even human. The first sign of this is when you hear her loudly snap her own neck, after which her head spins in a circle and 6 spindly legs emerge from her body. This is the true Mimi. Some people are frightened by spiders in real life. I'm actually not myself, but true Mimi still creeps me out every time I see her. There's something about that neck-cracking sound effect and the human torso that dangles uselessly from her head after she transforms. What really gets to me, though, is the slow escalation of the threat Mimi poses. At first she seems pretty harmless herself, even though you know she's lying and leading you into traps. By the third part of the chapter, it's become clear that she's also greedy, violent, and extremely cruel. Then the final part comes around, and you discover that she's a monster inside in more ways than one. She's not just a horrible creature, she's a horrible person. If there's one overarching message to the whole Metroid saga, it's that secret military weapons projects are a really bad idea. It's fitting, then, that one of the creepiest monsters to ever appear in a Metroid game is described as a bioweapon designed for military applications. You actually see the Nightmare quite a while before you know anything about him, as a shadow flying across the background and making strange metallic noises. You probably won't know it's him, though. When the computer later warns you that the Nightmare is an incredibly powerful creature that could destroy the entire station, he unfortunately leaves out the tiny detail of what the Nightmare, actually looks like. I know when I first played Fusion, I completely ignored that shadow when it first appeared. I assumed it was just some random background detail. Then this happened. Same sound, same shape. It was him all along. The Nightmare is a brilliant character design all around. The blank metallic eyes and the contoured shadow on its head make it look ghost-like, but the arms full of guns with the laser cannon in the center sell the idea that this is a robot designed to kill. It has a face, but it still looks utterly soulless, like a cave troll reimagined by H.R. Giger. Things only get eerier as the fight goes on. After a few hits, the Nightmare starts to warp gravity in the room, making the background twist and warp, while its eyes shed some kind of horrible green fluid so that it seems to be crying. Then a few more hits reveal its true face. Oh dear God. Imagine the scene where the bad guy's face melts in Raiders of the Lost Ark, only it's a green face with 6 yellow eyes. Not only that, but his face decays as you shoot him, turning from acid green to mottled beige and finally blood red. It all makes you wonder what the hell this thing is. It's supposed to be a bioweapon, not a living creature, but who would design something like this? Why would they put a faceplate on it that it can't see out of? Why did they fill it with green goo that seeps out of its eye holes? Why a lot of things? There are a lot of bizarre moments in DKC3, to be honest. This is a game where you turn into an elephant in order to fight a giant waterfall-dwelling crab by spitting into its eyes. But the most off-putting of its worlds has to be Mechanos, an island you reach about halfway through the game. Mechanos is a pun on the real Greek island of Mykonos, but unlike its namesake, which is a beautiful tourist destination, Mechanos is basically an environmentalist's worst nightmare. Every other level is a factory full of slag heaps and iron chains. The one level where you do go outside features a giant hacksaw that constantly slices through the trees you're climbing, with visible sawdust spilling off at either side. It's like a Dali painting if Dali had grown up in Canada. And this is all capped off by possibly the weirdest boss in the game, Chaos. A robot that looks like a canister vacuum cleaner with a tape recorder stuck in the middle. Chaos attacks you not with guns or bombs, but with retro rockets, spring-loaded knives, and boxing gloves. Then, after you deal enough damage to it, its head pops off to reveal... Vinny from Spaceballs? This game is weird, man. I don't think there's any denying that Psychonauts is one of the most bizarre and outlandish games ever released. This is a game that has you fight fire-breathing ballet dancers on a stage full of cardboard props, discuss high school wrestling with sombrero-wearing canine street artists, and witness a battle between G-men with rifles and evil Girl Scouts wielding explosive boxes of cookies. But what really gets me about Psychonauts is how many strange and disturbing things exist in the real world, totally apart from what you see in people's heads. The psychic bear who lives in the woods? He's real. The gigantic mutant fish that kidnaps campers? Real. The evil dentist who uses sneezing powder to make people literally blow their brains out? Yeah, he's real too. Sometimes this absurdity can really mess with your head. I remember the first time I played through Milla's stage, when Raz goes over the pool of water and a giant hand comes out to grab him. After Raz mentioned his family curse, I thought, oh, that's really clever. It's like he believes in the curse, so when he's in someone's mind, it's real for him, like the Matrix or something. Oh, Tim Schafer, you're so silly. A little while later, I went out to the lake in the overworld and started poking around. And what do you think happened then? A hand came out of the water, pulled Raz under, and he drowned. in real life. Turns out the curse isn't a psychological thing at all, it's real. It gets even worse in the second half of the game at the Thorny Towers Asylum. For anyone who knows something about real mental illnesses, the behavior of the inmates is a little too close to life. I was particularly freaked out by Gloria's near-instantaneous shift from sunny and friendly to violent and paranoid. Appropriately for a game that's about exploring people's minds, Psychonauts makes you question what's real and what's a dream inside the game. In the sense of blurring the boundary between delusions and reality, it probably comes closer to the aims of surrealism than any game I've mentioned so far. If you're inclined to theorize about games, Psychonauts certainly gives you a lot to theorize about. To conclude this little survey of skin-crawling moments, let's take a look at one of the most uncanny places I've ever run across in any game, and one that effectively mixes surreal creepiness with more traditional horror tropes. Long before the events of Majora's Mask, Icona was laid waste by a disastrous war, and the hell of it is that the undead inhabitants are still fighting it. A skeletal general patrols the roads bordering the kingdom, while ghostly spies attempt to infiltrate the ruined castle. Most of the characters you run into are out for blood. When they're not trying to kill you, they're grieving over what they've lost, or warning you that Icona is cursed and you don't belong here. It's like Dark Souls for kids, and by that, of course, I mean definitely not for kids. What was I thinking? In the shadowy recesses of Icona Castle, you find the king, or what's left of him. After fending off his attacks, you find that sunlight is able to destroy his undead form, and his spirit, freed from its cursed insanity, finally realizes what his kingdom's been reduced to. He tells you that Icona's curse emanates from the top of Stone Tower, and to help you climb it, he offers you, as he says, a soldier who has no heart. This is what it looks like. Now, you may recognize this thing from a popular creepypasta story written in 2010 called Ben Drowned, in which a haunted Majora's Mask cartridge does lots of spooky things, many of which involve this thing popping up in unexpected places. Even in the ordinary game, though, it's pretty unnerving. There's a serious uncanny valley effect at work here, because the statue has a more realistic art style than our actual main character, with visible nostrils and teeth and far less cartoonish eyes. It looks just enough like a real person that its fixed grin, unblinking eyes, and stiff immobilized posture are extremely jarring by contrast. It's an appropriate first impression for a dungeon that also has some of the creepiest enemies in any Zelda game, such as this, and especially this. There's also the fact that after you flip the temple upside down, you can die by falling up into the sky. Try getting that image out of your head when you're going to sleep after 4 straight hours of Zelda. A lot of bad things happen in Majora's Mask. A little girl is abducted by aliens. A monkey almost gets tortured to death on a spit. This guy has to sleep out in the cold because some jerk stole his identity. But Icona Canyon does an amazing job of convincing you that not only have the worst things imaginable happened here, but there's more on the way, and they're probably going to happen to you. It'll have you biting your nails, but it'll also make you twice as anxious to find out the rest of the story. And unlike some games I could name, there actually is a story to discover. Obviously, this collection of surreal moments is only a tiny slice of the huge cake of creepiness that is in video gaming. You'll find surrealism all over the place. Sometimes it's an image that's just disturbing to look at, like the original Jigglypuff sprite from the first generation of Pokémon. Sometimes it's an unexpected gameplay shift that sends the tone careening toward panic mode, like the Water Wraith in Pikmin 2. And sometimes it's just an odd detail that makes you stop and say, wait a minute, like the shadowy figures in that one Mario Galaxy 2 level, or the final boss of pretty much every Kirby game. These little moments might sometimes clash with the rest of the game they're in, but one thing you can say in their favor is that they're certainly memorable. All things considered, they're some of my favorite gaming moments that I've experienced, and I'm sure at least some of you feel the same way. Stay surreal, everybody, and happy Halloween!